Hello and welcome to NewsClick. Today, we are joined by Ambassador M.K. Bhadrakumar, and we'll be talking about the situation in Syria. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, so some days ago we saw the meeting between President Erdogan and President Putin in Sochi. And this was a very complicated negotiation. There are a lot of reports coming out after that. So would you say, what was your sense of the negotiation? Would you say that Erdogan in some senses has got what he set out to achieve on October 9th when he launched the invasion?
You know, very succinctly put, an entirely new phase in the Syrian conflict is beginning.
Right.
Just when Putin himself put it on record, I think about 3 weeks ago, at a Valdai Club forum in Sochi, that the Syrian war is over. And now you find that the parties who lost the war are trying to maneuver into a position to dictate terms of a settlement. There's a struggle going on there. Motives are very obscure. Transparency is lacking, especially on the part of, I think the Russian position is quite clear, crystal clear. But transparency is lacking on the part of Erdogan, Turkey. So a range of motivations are at work.
Right.
And the Americans have lost heavily and are trying to bounce back. It will be wrong to say, like there is a sense of triumphalism among certain quarters that the Americans have lost heavily and they are out of Syria. It appeared so, but the kind of rapprochement that is building up between Trump and Erdogan, it shows that the Americans have other intentions. If you analyze, you must first analyze the Turkish position, because Turkey being a neighboring country, immediate neighbor, inevitably it has great influence on molding what lies in the womb of time.
Right.
Turkey's considerations are quite varied. One is, evidently we hear quite a lot about border security. Secondly, in terms of the Kurdish problem, the specter that is haunting them is that the kind of Kurdistan that shaped up in the twilight period of the Saddam Hussein era in Iraq, in the northern region, might take shape on the borders of Turkey.
Right.
And the Turks are quite right that the Syrian Kurdish group called YPG, which is aligned with the US, is in fact a brand of the PKK, which promotes separatism and has killed tens of thousands of Turks in the kind of war that has been going on there. So that is, the Kurdish problem is quite serious. Then Turkey has specific interests. One is historical. Having lived there, I can tell you this, that it's an unsatiated power, Turkey, in the sense that it has a sense of, you say that about China again, that it has a sense of humiliation, a sense that great injustice has been done to it, this loss of territory on account of the Anglo-French conspiracy, the early part of the last century, and the settlement that took shape. And at that time, Turkey was very weak, and Atatürk decided to be content with what was left as the residue and build a new modern Turkish state on that, on entirely different principles of secularism, Western-oriented, turning its back on the Middle East and so on. But you know, it's difficult to believe that underlying this, even after 1 century, full century, there is this seething restlessness of the loss of imperial glory.
Right.
And particularly with regard to Syria, there is also the additional problem that part of this so-called French mandate given by the League of Nations at the time of the settlement was that the one province of Turkey bordering Syria called Hatay actually should have been part of Syria, and Syria never accepted it. Now, fudging this mandate, Turkey took away that province. So there's a territorial dispute also. So you see, all these things are at work. And then
there's refugees also there.
Refugee question is very much there. Initially, when the war began, Erdogan looked at it as a kind of trump card that he can hold. But as time passed, it led to a drain of resources. Right. And, you know, on social sectors like schooling, medical care, housing, and so on, 4 million people additional influx means it puts pressures on the social sectors. So there is a growing discontent in the Turkish society that these are unwanted people. Right. And politicians have to take note of that. So there is no question about it. It is a genuine problem that they would like to send these people back to Syria. That is very much there. Then there is the other question, what do you do when a war has been fought with the instrument of jihadi groups, extremist violent groups? You can call them only terrorist groups like Islamic State and so on. Islamic State and Al-Qaeda were supported actually by Turkey in the initial stages. Right. But like a Frankenstein, it took a different form and they lost control. But now these fighters are there in camps, detention camps. And these camps are located in the Kurdish areas, and Kurdish people are, fighters are guarding them because they are virulently anti-Islamic State. So they could only be trusted to see that these chaps are kept under control. Now what happens if, you know, they come back to haunt Turkey? Then, you know, finally the question is this, that, you know, that Turkey has always had an identity problem. That its preference, Erdogan's preference, you may find it a paradox, you know, that an Islamist leader like him is also Westernist. Turkey has a split personality that way. And his own preference in 2011 when the war began was that the Americans should co-opt him and put him in the driving seat in this regime change project. Right. Now, Assad was otherwise a close family friend of Erdogan. And at that time, you know, I don't want to get into too many details, but this was Barack Obama's project. General Petraeus, who as the CIA chief, was sent to Turkey to persuade them to spearhead this project. Right. And then Obama left. And that created the first tension between the United States and Turkey. Turkey was left holding the can of worms, you know. So you see, Turk's preference is that. And then the relationship deteriorated with the Americans once they began this dalliance with the Kurds. And they started promoting a Kurdish homeland in Syria. So a lot of bad blood. Then the coup in 2016 where Erdogan suspected that it had CIA backing. All these factors got into play. But my assessment is that even today, if a kind of a deal can be offered by the Americans, Erdogan will look at it seriously. You know, the Turks are also not very comfortable with their entente with the Russians, because the two empires had collided many times in history, and they have a troubled relationship. So for want of an alternative, and then Russians are present there next door, and the Turks have to deal with them. They don't like it that the Russians have established bases on their borders. It's a far more powerful military power. But so they need to balance that, they need also an American thing. You see, Turkey in the Cold War era was like an anchor sheet for NATO, you know, on the underbelly of Russia. And without Turkey, people do not realize NATO has no future. You know, it is the second biggest military power within NATO. Not only that, its geographical position without Turkey, the NATO would be very ineffective in the whole Mediterranean region. Black Sea, they cannot even come in without Turkey's concurrence, as per the Montreal Convention. So all these factors taken into account, Turkey is an indispensable ally for NATO. That is clear there. So Erdogan could bank on this, that even if he crossed a red line, the Americans will hesitate to act against him. Now I think the Trump is playing a very different way, shrewdly. He has got an alibi to withdraw the troops, because the moment Turks came in, he said that mean that American troops might get caught in the crossfire. And how can we clash with
and
a
the
NATO,
hallmarks of a pre-decided move.
NATO ally? There is even a theory that that they were hand in glove with each other.
Right.
But in any case, there is also the other part you can look at it. It is also possible that the Russians and the Iranians encouraged Erdogan, because left to themselves, the Russians and the Iranians were not in a position to get the Americans out.
Right.
And the only way of getting the Americans out was to
use their ally.
By Turkey threatening a military move into northeast Syria. Anyway, what happened is the net result is the troops have withdrawn from there. But now the point is, Turkish troops are inside, and Turkey is controlling something like 2/3 of the border with Syria.
Right.
And going back to this imperial, this so-called neo-Ottomanism, I think Russia has reason to be worried.
Right. So the other question would be regarding Russia's strategy here.
Yeah.
So they have an alliance with Assad, and the alliance was successful in, say, capturing certain parts of Idlib and the region itself. They stopped after, again, discussions with Turkey. And now we have a situation where Putin was willing to actually let Turkey establish dominion over what is Syrian territory. So how do you think the Assad-Putin relationship is actually looking at this situation, where on the one hand they are very keen on re-establishing, say, the integrity of Syria. In fact, the same day Assad was in the Idlib region and talked about and had very harsh things to say about Erdogan.
Absolutely.
So how do you see them? How do you see this relationship actually giving some land away to Turkey?
Let me just make one point that, when I used to work in Moscow and used to see this relationship in the Soviet era, they're supposed to be allies.
Right.
Hafiz Assad and the Soviets
right.
Leadership. Mm-hmm. But, often, we don't realize that the Syrians couldn't be pushed around at all. The Syrians held their ground, and it is an ideological regime. Right. This Ba'athist ideology is very deeply rooted nationalism in a certain way. Leftist connotations are there in a certain way, but it is there very much. So they could hunker down. Presently, Bashar is weak, and the fact is that without the Russian intervention, he would have gone under. Right. There's no doubt about it. At the nick of the moment, the Russians came in, and then salvaged the situation for him. Today, it's broken. The whole country is broken. He needs resources. He needs a protector. So he's not going to be. I think it's unrealistic to expect that he can take that kind of position of a sturdy nationalist. You rightly said about pointed finger at his statement in Idlib on Tuesday, where he called Erdogan a thief. Right. And it was the same day
that
the
meeting was taking place.
Right. So you see, Syrians are very subtle practitioners of diplomacy. He has, with that one remark, one statement, he has actually distanced himself from the Russian project. Now, Russia's dilemma is basically this, that Russia has, it's not only the Syrian part of the relationship, there is an overarching relationship with Turkey, which is also in Russian consideration, which is actually far more important. This is the only NATO power which has moved so close to Russia.
Purchased military equipment, for instance.
S-400. Yes. Now, it's not only weaponry, it also is a statement of fact that that they are because you see Russians control the system basically, so it's also a statement of fact that that they are building a strategic relationship with Russia. Then there are business interests. Nuclear business itself is, if I'm not wrong, it works out to something like some $30 billion projects. Almost entirely Turkey's gas supplies come from Russia. Now, a new pipeline called the South Stream pipeline is Turk Stream pipeline is going to be commissioned in December. And this pipeline comes and it will make Turkey a hub from where Russia will send the gas to Bulgaria, Austria, and places like that. It's a very big Russian project, just like the Nord Stream going and touching Germany.
Right.
So you see, it's a very important relationship strategically, politically. Then another important aspect we don't see is this, that this I briefly mentioned Montreal Convention. Under the Montreal Convention, only Turkey and Russia have a say on the Black Sea. Russian naval vessels, they have a naval base in Sevastopol. They can come through the Bosphorus Straits, it's a very narrow straits, and they will have to inform the Turks, and they can just go up, and that's the gateway to the Mediterranean for the Russian Black Sea fleet. On the other hand, no third country is allowed to have a military presence in the Black Sea for longer than 2 or 3 weeks at a stretch. So after informing Turkey, they take permission and send a NATO vessel into Black Sea. After 3 weeks, it has to come out and another ship has to go in. So in other words, Turkey's cooperation is vital for NATO to establish a presence in the Caucasus or to the east of Black Sea, which means, a containment strategy against Russia is unsustainable without Turkey's genuine cooperation. So you see, Russia has all these considerations in mind, and Russia also knows, as a historical memory, that it's a difficult relationship. Turkey is a very difficult power to handle, and you cannot confront like that, and you cannot bully like that. It's a country with a lot of grit, So the Russians are very cautious about the relationship. They are quite, as far as I can see, they are. You mentioned, that these negotiations were difficult. Truly so. I can imagine that they're truly, and I watched the press conference there. They were very grim, both of them. There were no body language was speaking loudly about it. They refused to, they didn't take any questions also, because it would have brought out differences. Now you see, the Russian worry is this: the Americans, all they have to do is to verbally encourage this Turkey's imperial instincts. And then Turks come inside and Turks stay put there. The Russians cannot easily dislodge them except, confronting. But for all these reasons, they don't want a confrontation and they don't want to break the alliance with the Turks. So this is going to be a problem. And Assad, on the other hand, you again mentioned that, is fundamentally, Assad can never reconcile with the fact that, that he is not controlling that region of his country. And some of these areas also contain the water resources and the main oil fields of Syria.
So the last key player, the United States. So you mentioned how it's too early to write them off from the picture. On the other hand, except for the verbal encouragement you mentioned, in the region, we are generally seeing a bit of a retreat as far as they're concerned. You mentioned that Israel, of course, is going through a tough time. Their ally Saudi Arabia is almost on the verge of negotiating with the Houthis. The strategy against Iran has not really worked out because the continuous pressure tactic has not got too many people. The other countries, European countries or NATO allies are not joined. And you also have a situation like in Syria where Russia and Iran are very much in the picture. In fact, the discussions invoke the Astana talks as one of the key elements of the discussion. So where exactly do you see the US having a proper entry point or stakes in this current situation?
This last statement by Trump I think day before yesterday,
Immediately after the
after
accord
the
was signed.
Sochi
Statement. He claimed credit for the ceasefire.
I can, but that is, Trump,
typical Trump,
and also that is grandstanding in front of the domestic audience, because there is a lot of criticism that he threw the Kurds under the bus and all that kind of thing, So he is countering all that and saying that I've done well, this is the message, claiming credit for things where he didn't perform at all, That's right. But he made a very important point that he will have a relationship with the Kurds. And this general who you mentioned is a very interesting character. Actually, I wrote about it yesterday. This general, Muslim, he spoke very glowingly about him. He was actually in the ranks of the PKK for 29 years. He's a hardcore PKK man. And now, an interesting fact is, he is also the foster son, adopted son of Abdullah Öcalan, who was the Kurdish leader in detention in Turkey. Now, Öcalan was captured when I was there in Turkey as ambassador. Öcalan, and they have kept him under detention, but they've been using him. And, he's a Marxist. He's a very colorful personality, in fact, and he was quite in alliance with the Syrians at one time. Now, he is now acting, he has given up the idea of separatism. He is content with a autonomous homeland within Turkey, and he is acting as a bridge between the Turks, between Erdogan and the Kurds. And he still he's a charismatic figure. He still has a lot of appeal, even though he's been in prison since 1998, undergoing life imprisonment on a desolate island in the Marmara Sea. Even then, he casts a shadow on the Kurdish problem. A larger-than-life image is there. Now, this man is his foster son. Now, he can also be a bridge between this foster son and Erdogan. Now, this general Muslim, Trump is going to get over to America. Erdogan is also going to America. So I have a feeling that Turkey is pinning on this a kind of a modus vivendi between the Kurds and Erdogan. And Erdogan was actually receptive to the idea of a political settlement of the Kurdish problem. Initially, to his credit, it must be said that he tried. And then, he had to mount the nationalist platform when he got into trouble with the military and all that. And then it became, a contradiction, and he gave up at a certain point. But basically, he's open to that idea. So Trump's this statement is a very interesting statement. What he is doing is, he doesn't want the military to do what diplomats can do, what diplomacy can achieve. It is cost effective. And he is going to use these codes to block the Iranian land route. From Tehran to Damascus. And he has also said that he is going to keep a few hundred American troops in the southern region called Al-Tanf. Now, that is closer to the Israeli side. So, the considerations are, Americans will try to exercise influence over Israel's security, Iran's presence, and a say in the overall Syrian settlement, even though they lost the war and their troops are no longer going to be staying there, etc. But it remains to be seen whether this ploy will work, because some kind of a force projection is required, because the others are also toughies. Iranians have got militia and Russians are not pushover, and the relations between Russians and the US is very poor now. And so, there isn't enough space for them, and nobody is wanting a confrontation, but they are all jockeying for position. So, power projection is possible only through military means. They unilaterally decided that Americans decided that their troops will come over to Iraq But Iraq has said nothing doing.
Exactly. They want
And they said that no, they threatened that that they will take measures to see that the Americans do not stay there,
Right.
because they don't want to get like in the Vietnam War. They brought in Laos and Cambodia into the struggle. So this is kind of thing, and they don't want the Americans to put the shoulders on the Iraqi shoulder, and fire at the Iranians. I'm very sure Iran has pulled strings to see that the American troops cannot stay there. Now, if not there, then Americans cannot have a force projection. So all these plans that Trump may have may still come back to this, what you said, that the overall picture is one of retrenchment.
That's all we have time for today. Keep watching NewsClick.